Before you move into the preliminary study, let's talk about one additional complication, which is making sure that the figures are scaled correctly in relationship to each other. Here's the problem. I asked you guys to make sure the figures are distributed in space at different depths. So let's say we have a picture that looks like this. Here's our rectangle. And then let's say for the sake of argument that we have a figure that is standing towards the foreground. So let's say right about here. Okay, now let's say we have another figure that is standing somewhere over here. Assuming that the figures are approximately the same height, how can we determine what the height of the second figure is if it's further away? This is a problem of linear perspective. If you've never studied linear perspective, I strongly advise you to look at my perspective tutorials. I'm going to move them into the 21A playlist for you guys to look at. But essentially, the very first step is to determine where your horizon line is in the picture. Now, most of the models in the new Masters Academy have a horizon line that is most likely somewhere through the upper chest. Either upper chest, sometimes through the head. It's a little bit difficult to determine from a photograph, but we can readily assume that our horizon line is going to be somewhere here, like this. The next step is to more or less arbitrarily place your vanishing point in the middle of your picture. Now, if you're doing some kind of scene of architecture and you can actually see where our orthogonal lines recede, so again, if you don't understand that terminology, orthogonal lines, please review the perspective tutorials. Within probably less than an hour, you should be able to understand everything we're talking about right now. You're going to establish where your vanishing point is, and then run a line through the middle of the figure to determine exactly where the first figure is standing in the space. So you're doing this. Then you're going to run an orthogonal line. Orthogonal line is a line that goes back in space to your vanishing point from the bottom of your figure and to the top of your figure, like this. All right. Now you know that if the figure starts moving back in space, it's going to shrink along these two lines. So all I have to do now is draw a horizontal line from where I want my figure to be, like this, and determine the height of the figure if it's standing the same distance away over here. So let's bring a line going up this way. All right, so now we know that if our figure is standing right here, it's going to be exactly this tall. Now all I need to do is transfer the height from here to where I want the figure to be. So I'm going to draw a horizontal line. It's going this way, another vertical line going this way, and then I can sketch in another standing figure. Like this. Okay, now the added complication is that you have different poses. So you might have one figure that's standing, another figure that's reclining, another figure that's seated. So let's do a figure that's a little further away, right about here, let's say. And let's make that figure seated, or like partially reclining. Okay? The first step is to determine the height of the figure as if it is standing, like this. So we know that the figure is going to be the same height here. Let's figure out the height. All right, so a figure that far away is going to be this tall. Let's bring the height over. so here's the height of the figure if it is standing. All right, now how do we figure out how big a reclining figure is? Well, we know that most figures are about 8 heads tall. So if we find the halfway point, let's say that's about the middle, that's half the distance. Let's find half the distance of the half, that's going to be a quarter. This is about 1/8 of the entire height. We're going to use this head size to figure out how big a reclining figure is. So here's our head size. Here's our head size. We know that the rib cage is 1.5 heads. Right? The distance between the rib cage and the hip, half a head. So now we can do semi-reclining, right? Figure, that's the correct scale relative to this one, and a different pose. So once again, this is where using simple geometric volumes is going to be really, really helpful. We know it's 2 heads from here to here. How big is the head size? It's this big. Okay, so here is a figure that's approximately the same size at a different depth. Now things get a little bit tricky if you have a figure that is tilting backwards. So a figure that is leaning like this. Things get a little bit tricky, but the precision is slightly less because people are going to have a really hard time figuring out whether you've scaled the figure correctly. Now, if you have a figure that's entirely cut off, right? So let's say you have a figure that is really, really, really big here, like this, going this way, so completely off the picture. Then really, for the most part, all bets are off. You can make the figure as big as you want because no one's going to really take a ruler, figure out where the feet of the figure end, run lines going back in space. Those issues really aren't as important because the figure could be really, really close to you, could be further away. We can't really tell because there's no ground plane. So you can see a lot more of this in more detail in my perspective tutorials. Again, I'll link to them. And I'll upload them to 21A playlist. What else can I tell you about this? Look, this stuff is really important. Unless for the sake of concept, you're deliberately making the figures in some kind of hieratic scale. Hieratic meaning, in order of importance. So in Egyptian friezes, for instance, the king is 40 times as large as the little slaves, or a little bit ant-like. But this can be important because, for instance, let's say I have a figure that's here that is this tall. Now, to the uninitiated, and particularly because we don't really have any kind of background, this figure might seem okay. Look, it's further away, and it's a little smaller than this figure. What's wrong with it? Well, let's figure out how big this figure would be if it's actually standing right here. Let's do that. Okay, here's the top of the figure, here's the bottom of the figure. Now we're going to run lines from here to here. Okay, so here is where the figure would be if it's standing here. Let's figure out the height. Okay, so this figure in actuality is some kind of giant person. Look, unless we're dealing with, somebody really, really short and somebody really, really tall, I guess this is still sort of falling in within the range of human variation, but that is a really, really large shift in scale. So watch out for this kind of stuff. When you're doing a preliminary study, work out the perspective of the situation and make sure that you're scaling things consistently.